When the deputies to the National Convention wrote a new constitution in the summer of 1795, they wanted it to end the revolution. They intended to found a conservative republic, one in which substantial men of property had the final say. This group was made up of substantial men of business and those who had made their fortunes by acquiring land seized from the Catholic Church and from the nobles who had opposed the new regime. The Constitution of 1795 needed to protect these men and their fortunes from two possible threats. First, the resurgence of leveling attitudes associated with the Jacobins. Though the Jacobin deputies to the convention, to a man, thought free markets and private property were the keys to French prosperity, they had been willing, under the extreme circumstances of war, civil war, and popular unrest, to enact strong measures to control the French economy, directing its activity toward winning the war and keeping the people fed. This had meant price controls, wage controls, and lots of central planning. The new constitution was meant to prevent these kinds of people from being elected and to prevent those restrictions on the economy from becoming the norm. Second, the constitution needed to protect against the resurgence of monarchism, of the kind seen in early October 1795. Royalists wanted to return to a modified old regime, and their platform threatened to return the property taken from the church and nobles to its previous owners, ruining many of those who had supported the revolution and prospered under it. Moreover, when Louis XVIII had proclaimed an amnesty for supporters of the revolution, he excluded politicians who had voted for his brother's death in 1793. This meant that the deputies of the convention could expect no mercy from royalists. The deputies decided not to give either faction, royalists or Jacobins, a chance to build a political base inside the new legislature. The convention decreed that elections would have to return a majority of deputies from the convention itself. Of the 750 seats in the new two-chamber legislature, 500 would have to be filled from the convention. The two-thirds ordinance, as it was called, was narrowly and rather suspiciously approved in a referendum. It triggered the royalist uprising of Vendémiaire in Paris in October of 1795, when 25,000 armed Parisians attempted the overthrow of the convention. The rebels were defeated by forces loyal to the convention, led in part by a rising star by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. But the danger remained. How could the new government, called the Directory after the five-man executive body selected by the legislators, prevent royalist or Jacobin deputies from taking control of the legislature in the future and modifying the Constitution to their own ends? The directors accomplished this, at least for a while, by shamelessly manipulating the electoral system, alternately persecuting or supporting the Jacobin left. The Jacobin left was a threat to the Directory, of course, but it was a Republican and democratic threat that meant to preserve the gains of the revolution. It was not an existential threat of the kind presented by the Royalists, whether moderates who wanted to return to the constitutional monarchy on the principles of 1789, or reactionaries who demanded a return to the old regime. After the Royalist insurrection of Vendémiaire in October 1795, the convention allowed a resurgence of Jacobinism to offset royalism. A new club was founded on the 16th of November 1795 called the Pantheon Club, after the refurbished church where the heroes of the revolution were buried in Paris. Radical newspapers were discreetly subsidized, and on the 17th of November, a radical named Gracchus Babeuf founded a new paper called Tribune of the People, in which he pushed for a much more radical government. He openly called for a return to the Constitution of 1793 and pushed for a return of economic legislation associated with the era of Jacobin rule. After two issues, government officials ordered his arrest, and Babeuf went into hiding, but he continued publishing. In February of 1796, facing a resurgence of popularity for the Jacobins, the Pantheon Club began having public readings of Babeuf's paper. This quickly led the government to reverse its policy tolerating radicals. This club and others like it were shut down. Former Jacobins were purged from government offices. In April, the legislature decreed the penalty of death for anyone who advocated a return to the Constitution of 1793. Increased repression of the left led Babeuf to gather a group of old lefties who began planning a kind of coup to restore the Jacobin Republic. It's a bit murky how far their planning ever got. Police spies kept Lazare Carnot, a director, informed, and on the 10th of May, the plotters were rounded up. The subscription roster from Babeuf's paper was used as a list to round up fellow conspirators. According to the government, the revolution had once again been saved, this time from something they called the conspiracy of equals. With the Directory's attention firmly fixed on repressing Jacobinism, Royalists were able to begin regrouping. By the fall of 1796, they were organizing in the open. In the first free elections to the Directory, which were to be held in spring of 1797, well-funded Royalists hoped to capture a majority in the legislature. Despite the serious divisions among Royalists over who should be the next king, they agreed that the Republic had to be overthrown, and by February of 1797, the Directors started pushing back against Royalism. In late February, the voting rolls were purged, with those who had fled from France during the Revolution and who had not legally returned struck from them. This dramatically weakened the Royalists. On the 10th of March, Louis XVIII encouraged the French to vote against Jacobinism and elect monarchists. And the French in the election did reject the Jacobins. When the elections were over in early April, no one identifying himself with the left had been returned to office. Only 11 of the 234 deputies hoping for a re-election had won their races. 218 of the 234 elected had no previous experience at the national level whatsoever. And of these 218, 182 were avowed open Royalists. The legislative councils were split, but the monarchists were able to cobble together an unstable majority. Royalism once again threatened the revolution. By July, the convention had brought the deeply Republican General Hoche into Paris to maintain order. 3 of the directors began hinting that they favored a return of old Jacobin supporters to politics. In response, Royalist bands began forming in Paris, getting ready for street fighting. The directors brought more troops to the Paris region. At the end of August, the legislature passed a decree removing penalties from those priests who had failed to support the revolution, the so-called non-juring or refractory priests. This decree was a step too far on the path towards a restoration of the monarchy, and on the 3rd and 4th of September 1797, the Directory enacted a coup against itself and against the legislature. It was called the Fructidor coup, after the month of the revolutionary calendar during which it took place. 2 of the 5 directors were purged, 53 deputies, including the president of the lower house, were arrested, 30 newspapers were shut down, elections from 49 different parts of France were annulled, and 177 seats in the legislature were left vacant. The Royalist threat was held at bay, at least for a time. In the 2 years left to the Directory on the grand stage of history, neither Jacobinism nor Royalism went away as a political force. The Directory continued to refuse its opponents a voice in government. During the next set of elections, culminating in April of 1798, the Directory engaged in fairly flagrant vote rigging. As the votes were counted, the directors simply chose deputies wherever it could plausibly declare a local election contested, and it annulled the results of elections it did not like, all with the goal of denying seats to radicals. Even then, in May, the Directory felt it necessary to purge 127 deputies. Election results in almost half of France were tampered with or annulled. The governors of France had decided to select their own electors rather than allowing their electors to choose them. No one was surprised when, after the elections of 1799, a new coup took place in June. But this time, it was a coup in which the legislative body, now with a Jacobin majority, purged the directors in an attempt to keep the directors from purging the legislature. The convention and the Directory had between them managed to give local politics stability in France and had buried many of the old grievances to allow a majority of the French to support a republic. They had not been able to unify France between any government in particular. It would take another coup to lead to that outcome, the coup of the 18th of Brumaire, which brought Napoleon Bonaparte to power. But that, as the saying goes, is another story for another time.